One of the notable and romantic episodes of the ancient Greco-Persian Wars is the Battle of 300 legendary Spartans with the army of Xerxes at Thermopylae in 480 BC. The tragic death of 300 Spartans and their king Leonidas is praised in numerous works. Just think of Zack Snyder's film 300. But let's figure out how it really was, and how many Greeks actually fought against the allegedly millions of Persians, and why everyone thinks that the feat was accomplished by the Spartans alone. Watch the video to the end. At the end, we will tell how Thermopylae really looked 2,500 years ago, and why today Leonidas and his Spartans would not have lasted even a few hours. Subscribe to the channel and click the bell so as not to miss new videos, and also watch our previous videos. There was a lot of interesting stuff there. So, the main source of information about the Battle of Thermopylae for us is the 7th book of Herodotus' history. Unfortunately, he himself was only 4 years old at the time of the battle, so he described everything based on what its contemporaries told him. So, what did Herodotus tell us about the number of Greeks and Persians? You see 2 quotes from his book. Let's first deal with the Persians. Herodotus writes about the hordes of Xerxes, which numbered 5,283,220 people. Nevertheless, most modern historians lean toward a figure of 200, well, at most 250,000. The minimal estimate of Xerxes' army is only 60 to 80,000. There's absolutely no talk of hundreds of myriads of Persians, just think about it. In fact, apparently there were no more than 200,000 of them. Well, now let's deal with the Greeks. Spartans, 300. And pay attention that we are talking specifically about hoplites. I will explain later why this is important. Then 500 Tegeans and 500 Mantineans. 120 from Orchomenus in Arcadia and thousands from the rest of Arcadia. 400 people from Corinth, 200 from Phlius and 80 from Mycenae. These are all Peloponnesians, that is, those who arrived exactly from the peninsula. In total, they amount to 3,100 people. This is also important. We will return to this right now. Next, the people from Boeotia, 700 Thespians and 400 Thebans. The Opuntian Locrians also came with all their levy. Herodotus does not say exactly how many there were, but much later, in the 1st century BC, Diodorus Siculus will say that the Locrians were thousands. Herodotus also writes about 1,000 Phocians. Consequently, from the rest of Greece, another 3,100 people came. As a result, we get 6,200 Hellenes at Thermopylae. But let's return to the points we asked you to pay attention to. First, the 300 Spartans consisted of hoplites. Herodotus says this: who are they at all? In ancient Greece, they are heavily armed infantrymen. But after all, not only they lived in Sparta. For some reason, Herodotus says nothing about the Helots, essentially slaves, and the Perioikoi, free but incomplete citizens. Meanwhile, they also were part of the Spartan army. But unlike the hoplites, they were lightly armed. Herodotus mentions only one Helot, speaking about Thermopylae. You see the quote? But did these lightly armed warriors participate in the Battle of Thermopylae? Most likely, yes. And here is why. Herodotus himself writes that against 300 myriads, that is 3 million, meaning the Persians, only 4,000 Peloponnesian men fought. Stop. 4,000 Peloponnesian men? But we have just counted that from the Peloponnese there came 3,100. Herodotus, how did you miscalculate like that? In general, from this we conclude that at least another 900 Helots and Perioikoi participated in the battle. By the way, the presence of the Perioikoi is also written about by Diodorus Siculus, whom we have already mentioned, saying that there were thousands of them. As a result, we get 3,100 plus 900 men from the Peloponnese, and add 3,100 from the rest of Greece, and we will get at least 7,100 people on the side of the Greeks. Let's step aside from the topic a little. I want to touch on a very interesting fact. In Plutarch, we can read how King Xerxes plays the magnanimous victor, and writes to Leonidas that he can become the king of Greece without fighting, only by taking the side of the Persians. In response to this, King Leonidas writes the following: if you had any knowledge of the noble things of life, you would refrain from coveting others' possessions. But for me to die for Greece is better than to be the sole ruler over the people of my race." Then Xerxes sends a second, but already short letter. "Hand over your arms." Leonidas answers even shorter, with 2 words that have outlived the centuries. "Come and take them." Let's return to the topic. One can say that the battle lasted a full 3 days, and in the end, on the 3rd day, the Greeks were simply slaughtered because of betrayal. If not for it, who knows how everything would have ended. Leonidas, king of the Spartans, according to Herodotus, having realized that the matter was most likely lost, ordered everyone to leave. As a result, besides the 300 Spartans, only the Thespians remained. Let us recall that there were 700 of them, and the Thebans, 400 people, since through their cities the path of the Persian army inevitably had to lie. So they were simply defending their native land at Thermopylae. By the way, Herodotus wrote his historical work at a time of enmity between Thebes and Athens. Therefore, he did not miss the chance to portray the Thebans as traitors of Hellas, and reports that the Theban detachment was held by Leonidas against their will as hostages. However, a certain logic is present in his words, since in the end, the Thebans surrendered to the Persians. It follows that even on the 3rd day at least, 1,400 Greeks still remained, not counting the Helots, not to mention that initially there were more than 7,000 of them. Not only the Spartans remained. Alright, the case with the 400 Thebans is murky, but the Thespians, who, by the way, were 700, not 300, certainly deserve their share of recognition, but for some reason they are very rarely remembered. And it is also worth saying that by the 3rd day of the battle, Xerxes' army had also lost a lot in number. As a result of the battle, out of 200,000, 20,000 Persians died. Nevertheless, there is no talk at all of 300 Spartans against 5 million Persians. In fact, about 10,000 fought against 200,000, even though the main forces of the Greeks left on the 3rd day. Few people know, but to the side of the large and even pompous statue of Leonidas in Thermopylae, there stands a monument to the 700 Thespians who died together with the Spartans. Kind of modest. On it we see Eros, the god of love, known as Cupid among the Romans. The Thespians honored him more than other gods. Eros has a broken wing and no head, and this is not for nothing. The monument explains to us that all this is symbols. The absence of a head, anonymity. The chest, courage. The wing, the spirit of freedom. The broken wing, self-sacrifice. On the front of the monument we see such words. It literally says, "In memory of the 700 Thespians." The Battle of Thermopylae took the lives of at least a third of the male population of Thespi of fighting age. For comparison, the real army of the Spartans, of which only 300 people were sent, consisted of 5,000 to 6,000 hoplites. Unfortunately, the tragedy of the Thespians did not end there, since the Persians destroyed their city to the ground. Finally, let's figure out what the Thermopylae Gorge actually looked like. To be honest, this area could be called a gorge only with a big stretch. In antiquity, it was a steep and swampy strip of shore. Herodotus described this area best of all. Thermopylae represented a narrow stretch of seashore about 7 kilometers long and no more than 50 meters wide, gradually widening and then narrowing again toward the Phocian wall to 20 meters. On one side of the gorge are mountains, on the other, the Maliakos Gulf, whose shores were swamps, and further the gulf itself passed into the Aegean Sea. In those times, and that was 2,500 years ago, the swamp lay very close to the mountains. Moreover, it was very deep. Today, both the area and the depth of the gulf have greatly decreased and continue to decrease. So if the Thespians and Spartans fought the army of Xerxes today, nothing would have come of it, because the distance from the city to the Gulf now is not 20 to 50 meters, but a whole several kilometers. In 480 BC, this narrow coastal passage, 20 meters wide, was further constricted by the stone Phocian wall, which we have already mentioned. It was precisely this place that the Greeks chose for battle. From the wall they saw all the enemy battle formations long before they could approach. The enemy, on the other hand, saw nothing. By the way, the Greeks even managed to restore the wall, which by that time had already become seriously dilapidated. And here appears Ephialtes. Unfortunately, because of whose betrayal, all this turned out to be in vain. He showed the Persians a bypass path that led through the mountains directly to the rear of the Greeks. Xerxes, of course, took advantage of the opportunity that presented itself. At dawn on the third day, the Phocians guarding the path saw a Persian detachment superior to them in number. Both sides were frightened by the sight of each other. However, the Persians, having learned from Ephialtes that those in front of them were not Spartans, decided not to be distracted from their main task and continued the flanking maneuver. The Phocians sent a runner to warn the Greeks about the Persians who were approaching from the rear. Thus the Greeks learned of the enemy's approach, and it was then, as Herodotus says, at the insistence of Leonidas, that most of the Greek warriors went back to their cities. Only Leonidas himself with the Spartans remained, the Thespians with their leader Demophilus, and the Thebans, as we said, against their will. The last Greeks were finished off by the Persians with arrows and stones. Leonidas, by the way, had already died by this time, so his epic death as the very last one in Zack Snyder is yet another invention. I would like to say a couple more words about Ephialtes, by whose name after the betrayal the Greeks named the demon who rules nightmares. He was born into the family of a certain Eurydemus from Malis. Ephialtes hoped for a reward from Xerxes, but the reward did not come to him, and instead he was forced to hide when the allied Greeks set a bounty on his head, seeking to punish him for treason. He was sentenced to death by the Amphictyons and was later killed at Antikyra by a certain resident of Trachis named Athenades around 470 BC. Although Athenades killed Ephialtes for another reason not connected with the betrayal, he received a reward for this. As a result, the Battle of Thermopylae was of great importance for the further course of the Greco-Persian Wars. It became a turning point in the war and played a decisive role in the victory of the Greeks. Its moral significance was colossal. The self-sacrifice of Leonidas and his warriors raised the spirit of resistance among the Greek poleis. This event became the main motive for uniting the Greek cities in the struggle against Persia, which was critically important for subsequent victories, in particular in the battles at Salamine and Plotae. It is often mentioned that Leonidas and his warriors knew that death awaited them and deliberately went to certain death. Despite the fact that the Spartans were ready to die for their land, historical data suggests that Leonidas counted on reinforcements and did not plan a senseless sacrifice. The Battle of Thermopylae leaves behind not just a story about war, but also deep lessons about the human spirit, leadership, strategy, and the importance of history. I hope this video was interesting to you. Tell us what you would like to hear and see in the next videos. And I have only to ask you to like, subscribe to the channel, write a comment, and wish you good luck. Do not miss new episodes. Bye.